unclean. And all of those reasons are external, aren't they? Like Steve said, everything, you're touching a dead body, you come in contact with a Gentile, you come in contact with any number of those things listed ceremonially as unclean. See? That's right. Giant list. I mean, chapters dealing with a list of animals and things they could not eat. Yeah, that's right. So they're familiar with these things. They're familiar with what makes them unclean. And like Steve said, you have things you can eat, things you can touch. I mean, everything to this point, where's the defilement coming from? All those external things that they're putting in. And so whenever you read verse 14 and he's turning, and I want you to look there when he had called all the people. So whose attention is he looking at now? He's kind of turned his back on the Pharisees and scribes. They don't have an answer for him. So now he's talking to the people. And I want you to look specifically at two verbs he gives. He says hear, and then what does he say at the end of verse 14? This is every preacher trying to communicate a lesson. There's a difference between hearing and understanding, isn't there? So the second layer of that, he says, don't just listen to what I'm about to say. He says, understand what this means for you specifically. And whenever he says that, the claim he's about to make in verse 15 is enormous because, like Steve said, this is something that they've been living under as far as their laws are concerned. Hundreds of years and generations they have gone through where they're looking at defilement and uncleanliness as an external problem. But now, what does he say in verse 15? He turns all of that and kind of puts it on his head. And he says in verse 15, there's nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. Okay, so stop for a second and think about what that means. If nothing external defiles a man, then what is he pointing away? What is he pointing at that's about to happen with the old law? It's going away, isn't it? That what they are familiar with, that law of uncleanliness and that law of defilement, it's about to be fulfilled is what we'll learn. That those things are now going away. But he says specifically, it's not the outside that you have to worry about. Where does defilement happen? Within, inside the man. And so whenever you stop and you think about what that means, defilement is not out there. And so another answer to the Pharisees and scribes, where they're making this case, and it's not even the law that they're talking about, but they're talking about this thing that made them unclean. And he's showing how ridiculous of a notion that what they're claiming is whenever it's not even God's law. But he says, even when you take into consideration God's law and you consider what it means to be unclean, he says, those things, there's nothing from without a man that can make you unclean. It's in here. It's inside the man that we have to now pay attention to. And we're going to look at here in a second why that's so important for us. And so the reason he says in verse 14, hear and understand, because this is a huge transition that they're about to have to undergo and take in. And so any other thoughts through those two? So under the law of Moses, and we mentioned it, if you want to write this down next to verse number 15, Leviticus 11 through 15, Numbers 15, those laws had a purpose and served a purpose, didn't they? And he's not saying that those things did not serve a purpose. He's not saying that it's wrong, but what were those laws in service of? What does the Hebrew writer say that the law would ultimately be? A shadow of good things to come. It's a shadow of what is really, truly going to be the end law of God. And so the Pharisees, they had built this entire religion based on external defilement, didn't they? And what that means is that you can go and you can be a holy person. How? Does it mean you have to be a good person internally in order to be not defiled by the Pharisees' perspective? No, all you had to do was wash. You had to avoid certain people. You had to quarantine. You had to do all of these things. And that means never touching certain things, never sitting with certain people, never doing any of those things that they would say, well, that is what defiles a man. And what Christ is saying, he says, take a step back and realize that the main problem of defilement, it lives within. It lives inside. And so the end of this, he says in verse number 16, if any man have ears to hear, let him hear. And he gives gives us that text again to say, let this sink in and think about what this means. because this is moving the needle. And so the disciples are concerned about this, as you can imagine. And what we've seen to this point is they have a problem understanding, and we would too, as we've understood now. This is hundreds of years of happening where they have undergone this law where it has been external defilement. But now look at verse 17, because so the disciples come to him, and they're going into the house. They're in private. Verse 17 says, and when he was entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he takes them, and they don't get it either. So they pull him aside, and they says, what are you talking about? What do you mean by these things? Because this is something that they understand. This is something that they know. And so Christ takes them through the kind of the plumbing of it. And he takes them through the background of here's what he's talking about. Now read verses 18 and 19 with me. And here's what he says. And he said unto them, are ye so without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats. Now, if you stop at the end of verse number 19, we might say, well, what is he talking about, right? What is he saying? And so one thing that Steve pointed out a second ago, which is what he's talking about specifically here, they had an entire law system built about things to avoid, especially food, right? There were certain things that you cannot eat. There are certain things that you cannot partake of. And so whenever he goes through, what does he say specifically in verse number 18? He says, does it literally defile you, or is it a symbolism of what it was talking about, that shadow of what is going to happen? He says, so as far as the heart is concerned, and he gives us the plumbing of it, so food goes into the mouth, into the stomach, and out of the body. Does it ever touch the heart? No, never touches the heart. And so he goes on to say this, and you notice at the end, by the way, of verse number 19, what is he pointing towards? What did we just pick up on might have just happened? So Acts chapter 10 comes about, and as Clint's been going through, and we're about to be there once he goes back to Acts, but Acts chapter 10 comes about, and you have the scene with Peter and Cornelius, and Peter's up on a rooftop, and Peter's really bothered by a problem, isn't he? And what problem? You remember, he's up on the rooftop that he sees, and what is bothering him so bad in Acts 10? You remember? God has now made all things clean, right? They're doing away with that unclean food, and by definition of that, Cornelius being introduced, now the barrier between Jew and Gentiles broken down. Those unclean people that they recognized and thought of as unclean are now being done away with. So that's Acts 10. Before this, though, Christ is already pointing at this. Let's see. That's right. Yeah. Right. Literally, physically, the heart. That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And this isn't the first time they've heard him either, is it? I mean, they've been with him, but Steve's exactly right. They are looking at this and thinking from a physical perspective and everything about it. And so whenever he's talking about the heart, well, what do they think he's talking about? Probably physically now. And beginning to break down that barrier of what they knew between the physical and the spiritual. And so as you get down through this, now I want to ask a question. Does this mean that the law was wrong? So if the law is not wrong, then what is Christ doing at this point? He's fulfilling it, and he's putting in something in its place that's better. And so when the substance arrives, the Hebrew writer says, whenever the substance arrives, do you need the shadow anymore? You don't need the shadow anymore because it's finally here. And he says, this whole time, here's what God has been trying to communicate with people. There are things that can defile a person. He's trying to show you there are consequences of uncleanliness. There are consequences of taking these things in. And now Christ is applying those things. He says, yeah, but now think about where this really matters. This really matters not with food and not with people. No, it really matters with things on the inside of man. And that's what he's talking about there. This is the important movement here of what he's talking about. Those internal things of man, that's where we find the problem. And so the defilement problem moves. And so now go to verses 20 through 23. So there's no question about what he's saying here because he's about to give us a list of things that are what he's calling these new defilements as far as what is actually defiling a man. So there's 13 defilements he mentions here. Verses 20 through 23 says, and he said that which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile the man. Now, stopping at the end of verse number 23. So he names 13 things, and if you take them in order, what is he talking about? And he say 13 things, and we can kind of combine them all to what you and I understand as we go through this. But 13 individual things here. So the first one he gives, and you think about, to this point, why this is so drastically different. Have they looked at these things that he has just named as things that would make a person unclean? They should have. They should have had an understanding that these things would make a person unclean. This is not new information. So we know that under the old law, did God never talk about these things? No, he did, didn't he? In fact, we have a lot spoken of. This is not a new introduction of what sin is. Sin has already been defined, but now he's saying, understand where defilement truly comes at and where it comes from. Get rid of this notion that what touches you on the external is what defiles you. He said, these are the problems. And so he gives us the list of things. And the first one he gives us, the King James describes it as evil thoughts. And that, it's kind of interesting. The very first thing that he gives, I think everything else is upstream of this. This is upstream of everything else that he gives. And so the very first thing that he gives there that would make a heart unclean, that comes out of the heart, is evil thoughts. Now, evil thoughts, what is he talking about? Where do unclean things come from? They don't come external, so where do they come from? So that's right. It starts here, doesn't it? It starts in the mind. And as it starts in the mind, you think about where these evil thoughts go. And this is a corrupt mind. This is a mind that does not care about righteousness. And everything else is upstream from this. And so as he names these other things, he gives us these lists. And now some of them, you notice, are going to deal with the topics at the hand, but they're going to have different meanings and definitions. He gives us 2 sexual sins there. And you notice that, again, he's talking about what comes out of the heart. These are what defile you, not the external thing that we were talking about as far as the old law. So he gives us, what does he say? He talks about adulteries. Now, when you think about that definition of what exactly is adulteries, that sexual sin dealing with inside the marriage, breaking of that covenant. And then second, coupled to that, in dealing with sexual sin, fornications, that word porneia, the word we get pornography from. This is those things that every sexual sin outside of the marriage covenant, covering that blanket term. And so thinking about where defilement truly happens. And like I said, this is not new information to these people. But the problem is, do you think they held up these things as important as their own external defilements? Because it sure seems like they're a lot more concerned about ceremonially washing their hands than true sin. And the problem we're looking at is they're so disproportionate to what the actual problem is that they may be looking at these things and we think about the problems that these things are, but they're not recognizing them. No, he says this is really where our problems lie. This is where defilement comes from. And so the same thing is true of you and I today. So then he goes on and talks about violence. And he says specifically there are 2 things, murders, and then he goes and talks about thefts. And so you think about the violence that takes place. And so murders, the taking of innocent life. This idea of unrighteous anger and taking away a person's life as a result of it. And then he goes on and he talks about thefts, taking what belongs to another. This next list, he goes on and says and deals with orientation things. He talks about covetousness and wickedness. Covetousness, that is that idea of the greedy grasping for more. And you notice one thing that's very interesting is that covetousness in this case is plural. And what that means is that it is not a moment. This is habits that we have. The habit of coveting after, the habit of going after and wanting something from what somebody has. And then he goes and he talks about wickedness. Now, you think about wickedness as such a broad term. We say, well, what all covers wickedness? And this is the attitude, this is the disposition that seeks to cause harm. You want evil to befall somebody, and you actively go out. You may be participating in it, and it may be even from the heart, but you actively want something bad to happen. Or you actively want sin to succeed. And so he gives us covetousness and wickedness. And then he goes down and even talks about things relationally wise. And he talks about things such as deceit, lasciviousness. You think about what those two things mean. The deceit meaning being a deceitful person, baiting the hook, waiting in store for somebody to go over and you have a hidden agenda and your smiling face is ready for that hidden agenda to happen. And then what exactly is lasciviousness? That's an interesting idea, lasciviousness. I don't think we probably talk about lasciviousness too much in using the word. We have a lot of lasciviousness, but what does that word mean? It is a sin dealing with the actual definition, unrestrained sexuality or sensuality. And what lasciviousness is the man who has stopped caring about what people think about his indulgence. It's these completely rampant parties and these ideas where you've so gone away from God that you are unrestrained in sexuality and sensuality. You have completely given yourself over into lust. And this is a picture of a person that's not recognizable anymore by what he is himself. And then he gives the disposition. And there's 4 things at the end of this that he gives. He talks about an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. Now that evil eye, it goes back to that envious eye. He begrudges whenever somebody succeeds. You ever catch yourself wishing they didn't? Wishing that they were unhappy, wishing ill upon them. That's the evil eye. That's a Jewish idiom that he gives, and it's an evil eye. You begrudge somebody who has gotten a blessing. You do not like that they have gotten a blessing. And then he says blasphemy, slander of God, slander of the Son of God, slander of the Son of Man. And then the 2 final things there, pride and foolishness. Those 2 things go hand in hand a lot of times, don't they? Pride dealing with the spirit that lifts himself up over everybody else. And what do we learn about pride? What usually goes right after pride? Typically the fall, isn't it? And that always seems like the case. And then finally, the foolishness. Now, foolishness is an interesting thing because you and I would use the word fool and think, well, we know probably a lot of fools. What we would say in the English language as far as being a fool, we would say, I don't know that means sinfulness. What he's talking about there is the foolish man. In Psalm 14, what does the foolish man say? You remember? There is no God. The foolish man and the foolish people in Romans 1 and 2 that Paul is talking about in this context are the people that look at all of the evidence for God and say he does not exist. The foolish man is the one that is morally senseless. He has no senses about morality, about justice, about following after God. The mind of the fool is the one that says there is no God. Now stop with this list and look at the range of things you and I just went through. So we have everything from dealing with the sexual, violent, financial, verbal, dispositional, theological. And what is he describing here? What is this heart that he is telling us about? Has this heart been defiled because it has taken in and eaten something it shouldn't have? Or what is defiling this heart? It is those things from within. And you notice we can summarize all of it by saying this. It is a heart in rebellion. Now, very important question. The most important question so far that we've asked. Can any of these things be fixed by hand washing? Can any of them be fixed by the ceremonies that they have? Can any of them be fixed by a ceremonial diet? By avoiding certain things? Can any of them be fixed by keeping your distance from a Gentile? So the question is then, how do we fix these things? How do we fix these things? I can't do it with ceremonial hand washing. I can't do it from staying away from a certain group of people. Now, you don't have to worry about the answer to that because we have the answer and it's coming later. But the Pharisees had chosen the easier problem and they'd called it holiness, and that was their problem. They had chosen to look at these things and say, to look at me and these things that they could prove by everybody else. Well, the problem was with the majority of these things, can you see a lot of them but just by looking at a person? No. Where are these problems at? Inside a man. And so whenever you think about those things we have to work on, those things that we have to fix, these are the problems that we really have to focus on. So as he continues reading there, and here's what he says. And I want you to think about what this means. There are 2 religions here and 2 very different answers that we have. And if you think about these things, if uncleanliness comes from without, then religion becomes outside management. And that means that you avoid certain things, you wash certain things, you manage the perimeter. That is a religion that any person can perform and still be holy. But the problem is, if uncleanliness comes from within, like Jesus just gave us the 13 things, those 13 things that would lead to what truly defiles a man, then religion must then be transformation. It must mean that there is a change that has to take place internally. It's not any longer things that I have to do and manage on the outside. No, the heart must be dealt with. I have to actually deal with the spiritual side of myself, the spiritual side of my choices, if I want to be able to overcome these things. And so the first religion is that one that's produced by the Pharisees, that external scrub, that fixing it by just going through these things, these ceremonies. But the second religion is what actually produces Christians. That is the following after Christ religion, is fixing and working on those internal things. Now that is why the gospel is good news, and I'll tell you why. If defilement were only an external thing, could we do all the rituals in the world and fix it? Yeah. If it's only external, you and I could have ceremonies, we could have sacrifices, we could do all these things. But then the problem is, if defilement is internal, and if defilement is actually in our hearts, there's only one that can help us handle these problems, that can actually help us to deal with these problems. And what is the gospel then? What is the good news? That we have the solution to those problems. Now, in and of ourselves, what we'll find out, what we already know is I can't deal with these problems on my own. I can absolutely go away with it, but it still leaves that stain. There's only one that can help us to truly wash it away, though. And so he's pointing and he's saying here, what is this a religion of? Is this a religion of physical things anymore? Or are we looking at a spiritual religion that we have to take into consideration our hearts and what we are taking into our bodies and our minds, that those things that are coming out are what defiles us. Those actions that you and I do are what defiles us. And so all of this leading to a very important conclusion for them, which is very hard for them to understand. Like Steve mentioned earlier, hundreds of years have passed, generations have passed. They're not used to this side of inside transformation. They should be, but they have upheld that external scrub, and those things maybe is more important. And so this is a huge transition that's going to take place. Now, what does that mean for you and I today? We say all these things talking about the Pharisees. Has that changed for today, though? Or do we still have to have an inside transformation take place? All those 13 things he gave a second ago, does that apply just to the disciples or me and you? So now we're looking at those things that apply directly to you and I, those things to get rid of, those things to deal with, those things that truly defile us. And so the same thing is true. Those same things can defile us and defile them. So any other thoughts through verse number 23? Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, here's another one, and while we're on this topic, there is something to be said about there's things for us to do externally to worship God, right? I mean, we have external worship today that we are required to do. This morning, whenever we're going through and we have our 5 acts of worship for God, so the question for you and I is this: can I just do those things and be holy if I have all these other problems within? No, that's the same problem that can be had. So I can fall into that same trap if I'm not careful. I can be here and I can do all the things that I've been commanded. I can go through and do all of them. But in reality, if I'm not in looking at the heart, does it make any difference? No. So we can fall into that same trap today. Very easy to, if we lose perspective on what's important. So we're talking about inside transformation. Now, here's a change that's about to take place here. And this is where it gets really confusing for people. If you pick up Mark 7 and you don't understand everything we've just read through 23 verses, and you go into this next part, it's going to make less sense than what we have just went through, because now understanding the context of what everything he has said and what he is doing. Now as we get into part 3 of this chapter, now we can understand it a little bit more. So now he's going to go to Tyre, which if you think about it in the outside perspective, it probably doesn't make any sense, but think about what he's doing. So read verse 24 with me. Verse 24 says, "And from thence he arose and went into the borders of Tyre and Sidon, and entered into an house, and would have no man know it, but he could not be hid." So the question is, the first question we have is, where exactly does he go? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of context here. The place he's going in Tyre and Sidon, this is going to be what's called the Phoenician coast, and this is Gentile country. This is pagan country. This is a place where I believe it was Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Amos all said, avoid this place, and this place is, and this people specifically, because of how evil and wicked it is. And so he's going into this place, and he's walking straight into a place. Do you think the Jews would think he's clean for going in there? No. So what is he doing? Is he proving to them? So at this point, as he goes into Tyre, which, like I said there, this is a place where many prophets condemned. From the Jews, what would that make him? Well, it typically would make him unclean, and he's proving to them it doesn't matter the place. The place is indifferent here. And so the Pharisees have just accused him of being loose with ceremonial code, and now he's going us and showing us the land does not what defiles you. The heart is. Now keep reading of what happens. Verses 25 and 26 says, "For a certain woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nation, and she besought him that he would cast forth the devil out of her daughter." Now, stop again at the end of verse 26. So everything Mark tells us about her disqualifies her under the old system. There are 3 strikes against her right off the bat. What is the first thing that we learn about her? Where is she from? She's a Greek. Okay, well, if she's a Greek, then what does that mean? She's not a covenant keeper. She's the opposite of the Jew. And then it goes on to say, even more specifically, a Syrophoenician by nation. Now, this is a descendant, if you go back in Old Testament history, she is descended from the very people that God's prophets had called and said, and Isaiah told him, you separate yourself. You get away from these people because they are wicked. So she's a Greek, she's a Syrophoenician, and then it says that her daughter had an unclean spirit. Now, if you are a Jew, what would that mean? That she is unclean, right? Because she's come in contact with her. So not only is she unclean, who else is unclean? Her daughter is unclean. So 3 strikes right off the bat. And here's the craziest part of it. As you're reading through, what is the first thing that she does in verse 25? First action she does. She hears about him and then falls at his feet. And his very own people have been following him around and doing what? Berating him, trying to find him in sin, finding any way that they can to get the public sway away from him. And he comes across a lady who should have 3 strikes against her, who right off the bat should not be anything close to the picture of what righteousness looks like as far as the Jews are concerned. And she's the one that falls at his feet. She knows enough to come to him. And here's a hard saying we're about to read. Verse 27 says, "But Jesus said unto her, Let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it unto the dogs." Now that verse is a troubling verse to a lot of readers. And it's a troubling verse because if you read it carefully, you think, well, if you and I were to call somebody and you say you're a dog, what would that mean? It's not a term of endearment, is it? Usually. I mean, I think in baseball you might say somebody's a dog in a good way, right? But not typically, right? If you call somebody a dog, you're not saying it in a good way. And so you think about how he's saying it, though. What is he talking about in verse number 27? Who has been, the people-wise, his main priority to this point? His own people, right? Israel. Israel's been the first priority. In Romans chapter 1, verse number 16, whenever Paul is talking about his own ministry, he talks about who is he going to first? To the Jew and then to the Greek. And so the mission first that Christ has is to Israel. You have Israel's redemption that he is going after. And what he's saying here at this point, he's not calling her a dog as you and I would call her a dog. He's saying, I have to take care of the children at the table first. I cannot afford to go out and to go and look to those that are not sitting at the table, because right now my focus is on Israel. And so he's giving her this perspective, and he's giving the disciples there. And so whenever you think about who she is, she hears this, and look at what she says in verse 28. Now think about all of this in consideration to what we have heard from his own people. She tells him, "Yes, Lord." Now this should be a pagan. This should be a person that worships idols. This should be an unclean person. But verse 28, and she answered and said unto him, "Yes, Lord, yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs." And so isn't it amazing who has proven herself to be so far above and beyond what the Pharisees and scribes were? And they're supposed to be the religious leaders. They're supposed to be the ones people follow. And yet, when you compare them to this woman that is all things pointing against her from everything we've read, what does it say about her? You think about the first thing she says, "Yes, Lord." She does not argue with the priority that it's not Israel. She doesn't argue with them. She does not demand equal sitting. She says, "I understand. You have a job to do." But then she gives him this, and she stays and she presses a little bit. She said, "Yeah, you're right." And that's exactly true. But there are times whenever you consider that the dogs are able to take the crumbs that are coming off the table. And she says, "That's all I'm asking for is one crumb. One little crumb of your mercy is good enough for me." Which, how ironic is it then that she herself, she's not asking for a spot at the table. She's saying, "I'll take anything I can get." And think about what faith means for her versus what it has meant for so many he has come across to this point. That is the picture of what is faith. It is faith enough that'll take the crumb. It is faith enough that doesn't demand that you have a seat at the table, that demands that everybody looks at you the same way. It is faith enough that is not offended by the place that you are in. It is faith that knows that one crumb from the hand of Christ is worth more than anything else in the world. And so he gives her this in verses 29 and 30. "And he said unto her, For this saying, Go thy way, the devil is gone out of thy daughter. And when she was come to her house, she found the devil gone out, and her daughter laid upon the bed." So as you stop at the end of verse number 30, he says, "For this saying," because of your faith, because you have said this, because you did not turn away, because you're comfortable and content with the crumb, which is so far above and beyond what we've read to this point, go your way, the devil is gone. Now, compare for a second the two visits to Jesus we've had in this chapter so far. So the first visit we talked about, the men from Israel came to inspect Jesus, and they came and they're mad. Because of the covenant standing, because of the credentials they have, because of this clean hands doctrine they're passing down, and they leave with kind of their tail tucked between their legs, truly as a picture of what you and I would call the dogs. He sent them away with a rebuke, and then the Gentile mother who comes to him bows at his feet, and whenever she does that, who has no standing, she's got no credentials, she's unclean, and how does she leave? She leaves with her daughter healed. And that is Mark chapter 7. That's the inversion here of what we think to be true and what the Pharisees and scribes and the Jews think to be true versus what is truly true. Now, which one of these two visitors sound more like us when we come to God? Which one do we sound like? The one going through the motions and one ceremonially clean, or the one that says a crumb is enough? What do we say? All right, any final thoughts? We're going to pause here at the end of verse number 30. Any final thoughts, questions, comments? All right, let's pause here at the end of verse 30. We'll finish up Mark 7 next week. And if you get a chance, read chapter 7, because especially the end of chapter 7, because it's going to make more sense now that you know what the chapter's dealing with, and kind of help us to get all of it in perspective. So pause here. We'll take a quick break before worship service, but I appreciate you all for your comments and attention. We'll finish chapter 7 next week.